When Lena Ortiz asked me to read the timestamp out loud for the third time, I could hear the air in that boardroom change, and I finally understood how silence can turn into a verdict. Miles was still standing at the far end of the table with one hand on the back of his chair, and 10 minutes earlier he had used that same posture to tell everyone I had missed a regulatory distribution deadline and put his company at legal risk. He said it in front of his executive team, my managing partner, client counsel, IT, and the two directors who had watched him blame me in every meeting for 6 months. He expected another easy scene, one where he declared a failure and the room accepted it as fact. Lena did not look at him when she spoke. She looked at me and said, "Ms. Dixon, read the delivery receipt from top to bottom, including server response code and time zone." I read every line in a steady voice, including the message ID, the client gateway acceptance, and the exact time the message was accepted by Kettering Biologics' own mail security appliance, 48 minutes before the contract deadline. Raven had pulled the same receipt from our immutable journal archive and mapped it against their gateway logs, and Ethan Cole had already confirmed the match in writing before that meeting began. Miles tried to interrupt and argue that acceptance did not equal delivery, so Lena asked Ethan one question that changed the room's balance in less than 5 seconds. She asked whether their internal quarantine policy delay occurred before or after gateway acceptance. Ethan said it occurred after acceptance, and he said that meant the delay was inside their own environment and outside our control under the service agreement. That answer resolved the one obstacle Miles had been hiding behind, which was his claim that I had no proof of custody at the deadline line. Once Ethan tied their logs to my message ID, that claim stopped existing. Nobody applauded. Prestige settings do not work like that. People write notes, close folders, and change where they place their eyes. Priya stopped looking at me as if she was preparing for damage control and started looking at me as the person who had protected her firm from a reputational strike. Lena asked for a formal correction to be entered into the minutes, including the language that the deadline was met by our team and that internal client routing delay had created the appearance of non-delivery. She also ordered an audit of sponsor communications because verbal directives had been used to circumvent workflow controls. That was the peak, and everything that mattered had already happened before we entered that room. I had spent a year learning exactly how a powerful person can perform certainty while building deniability behind closed doors, and I had spent the same year building a record that could survive his voice. The day I took over the Kettering Biologics account in 2023, I thought I was inheriting a prestigious client with a mature compliance culture. I learned within 2 weeks that I was inheriting a sponsor who treated processes, theatre and accountability as something he could move downward whenever he needed cover. I worked at Halberd & Rowe, a compliance communications firm that handled high-stakes distribution workflows for regulated clients. My title was Senior Delivery Lead, and I had earned that role through a sequence of difficult assignments where deadlines were legal boundaries, not preferences. I had spent 9 years in records-grade communication systems, and the early part of my career included one failure that shaped me permanently. In my 3rd year at a different company, a partner team insisted they had not received a required notice we had sent, and our logs were incomplete because a contractor disabled journaling for performance. I watched senior staff absorb blame they could not disprove, and I promised myself I would never stand in that position again. That wound sat beneath my discipline for years. I looked composed in meetings because I had practiced the cost of showing panic to people who mistake emotion for weakness. I answered briefly because over-explaining gives manipulators material to rearrange. When clients asked loaded questions, I gave exact answers and documented each one in writing. People read that restraint in different ways. Supportive colleagues saw professionalism. Opportunistic executives saw someone they believed they could overrun in public and rewrite in private. Miles Kettering belonged to the second category, and he had a polished version of that method. Miles was the COO, and he moved through rooms like a man who expected acceptance to arrive before evidence. He opened meetings with certainty, made verbal demands in side channels, then avoided written approvals that could tie him to risky decisions. In formal threads, he wrote short disclaimers that looked procedural, including phrases like pending final alignment and subject to sponsor review, and those lines gave him room to deny what he had pushed for by phone. I recognized the pattern in 2024 when he started asking for off-workflow rushes tied to investigator communications, each one framed as urgent and confidential, each one missing the signature trail our service agreement required. The first public humiliation happened during a quarterly steering session in their headquarters atrium conference suite, a place designed to remind everyone who held institutional power. We were reviewing cycle time metrics, and I had prepared a variance report that explained where approvals were stalling. Miles interrupted before I reached the second slide and said, in front of 16 people, that process people always hide behind checklists when urgency appears. He turned toward me and said, if I wanted to stay on his account, I needed to learn business speed. That line drew small laughs from people who had never seen the post-incident investigations that follow rushed compliance communication. I kept my answer to one sentence and moved to the next metric because my real obstacle in that moment was not the insult, it was the absence of a verifiable trail linking his verbal directives to the timeline distortions he was about to blame on me. If I defended myself in the room without proof, I would look defensive and isolated. If I waited and documented each instruction, his pattern could become visible to people who cared about process. That was the calculation I made, and it required swallowing scenes that still make my chest tighten when I remember them. From January through late summer 2024, Miles repeated the same methodology with small variations. He called me directly instead of using the project channel. He pushed for same-day distributions before legal sign-off and asked me to hold back written confirmations until he cleaned language with leadership. He requested draft sends to personal assistants outside the approved list, then asked in larger threads why the approved list had not been used. Every move had one function, which was to make me operationally responsible and evidentially exposed. Each time I responded with a confirmation email summarizing his request, and each time he replied with diluted phrasing that could be interpreted multiple ways. Priya Nassar, my managing partner, understood the account's political value and did not want open conflict with a major sponsor. She was not cruel and she was not blind, yet her caution was structural. She needed proof before she could challenge a client-side executive with board visibility. Early in that cycle, I asked for permission to route all sponsor directives through recorded workflow channels. Priya said we should try relationship repair first, which translated into one more quarter of me absorbing verbal pressure while preserving evidence. I accepted that decision because pushing harder without proof could isolate me inside my own firm. My turning point arrived through Raven Walsh, who sat 2 floors below my team in email security and e-discovery. Raven was the person people called when an executive said an email never arrived and legal needed an answer that could withstand external review. She had a reputation for precision and a habit of speaking only after she checked every source twice. We met during an internal training refresh on retention policies, and she noticed my notes because I was marking message ID handling and chain of custody retention windows more aggressively than anyone else in the room. After the session, she asked me what I was seeing on my account, and I told her enough to ask the right technical question. Her question was simple and decisive. She asked whether I had enabled immutable journaling on all outbound sponsor communications that crossed legal deadline thresholds. I had enabled it in March after the second off-workflow incident, and I had done it quietly because I expected resistance if I announced it. Raven said that single choice meant I had a chance to survive a future blame transfer. Before she reviewed the archive, I could not prove what happened after send in a way client counsel would accept. After she linked journal records to handshake responses from destination gateways, I could prove transfer custody with independent evidence. That was the obstacle she resolved, and it changed what was possible for me. The incident that forced everything into daylight involved a required communication to active clinical trial sites after a protocol amendment and safety clarification. The deadline under our statement of work was 5 p.m. Eastern on a Thursday, and our role was to deliver the approved package through the controlled distribution list once legal released final language. On that morning, legal release was delayed by sponsor edits Miles inserted during a private call I was not invited to. He still expected distribution by 5, and he started texting me at 2:13 p.m. asking whether I could just push now and tidy record later. I replied in writing that I needed counsel release and list confirmation first. At 3:41 p.m., Lena's office issued approved language. At 3:49 p.m., I sent final list confirmation and pre-flight checks. At 4:11 p.m., I initiated distribution through our secured relay, and at 4:12 p.m., our system recorded acceptance by Kettering's inbound gateway with an SMTP250 code linked to the message ID. Those times mattered because they established custody transfer before the contractual deadline. What happened next occurred inside their environment. Their quarantine policy held the message set for additional scanning after acceptance, and some recipients did not see the notices in inboxes until after 5 p.m. Miles had approved that stricter policy 2 weeks earlier under an internal security update, which I only learned months later through audit records. At 5:27 p.m., I received his first accusation by email with 12 people copied, including Priya, legal operations, and 2 board liaisons. He wrote that my team failed to distribute by deadline and that he expected a root cause memo by morning. I responded with a short factual note confirming 4:12 p.m. gateway acceptance and attached the delivery receipt. He replied 9 minutes later that technical artifacts are not the same as delivery, which signaled the strategy he would use in public. He intended to collapse contractual handoff and internal routing into one narrative and place the entire result on me. The next morning, he escalated in a cross-functional call where people who had watched him dismiss me before were present again. He described me as rigid, said I had hidden behind timestamps, and claimed the account had suffered because I prioritized procedure over patient communication. That framing was effective because it attached moral language to operational facts, and people become cautious when they fear appearing indifferent to patient safety. I kept my answer narrow, stated the documented send and acceptance times, and asked that any performance review include full gateway logs from both systems. He ignored the request and moved to the next agenda item, and several attendees looked down instead of at me. I knew at that point that private clarification would fail. The obstacle was no longer technical ambiguity, it was audience capture. He had established a social script where questioning him looked disloyal to urgency. I needed the same audience to hear an evidentiary correction from someone whose authority he could not dismiss. That required legal review, IT confirmation, and a record path he could not edit. Raven helped me design the packet, and we worked nights for 4 consecutive days building a timeline from immutable journal entries, relay records, and matching client-side headers pulled through discovery request channels. Raven never dramatized anything. She asked for exact artifacts, verified hash integrity, and refused any interpretation not anchored in logs. She found that my message ID matched their gateway acceptance event at 4:12 p.m. Eastern, exactly as my receipt showed. She also found an internal policy change ticket approved under Miles's operations office that increased post-acceptance scanning depth on high attachment communications, which explained delayed inbox presentation. Ethan had not volunteered that ticket earlier, and I understood why when I spoke to him privately. He was conflict-averse and had been instructed to route questions through sponsor leadership before releasing infrastructure details. Once Lena's legal hold notice arrived, his hesitation lost cover, and he produced the records. Priya still hesitated to confront the client directly until the packet reached a threshold she could defend with confidence. I asked for one thing: a formal incident review where legal, IT, sponsor leadership, and our firm would all be present, and where records would be shown in shared view. She agreed once Raven completed cross-system correlation and Lena accepted the review scope. That decision resolved my immediate barrier. Before the formal review was scheduled, Miles controlled the narrative through selective meetings. After the review was scheduled with mandatory participants and shared exhibits, he had to answer the same record in front of the same witnesses he had influenced. In the week before that meeting, Miles intensified pressure through tone rather than evidence. He sent me 2 late-night emails suggesting it would be in everyone's interest to characterize the event as process ambiguity and close it quietly. He implied our retainer renewal could be affected if I pushed a hard evidentiary line. I forwarded those messages to Priya and legal, then replied to him with neutral language that all timeline determinations would be addressed in the scheduled review. He wanted me to step into a private compromise where the truth blurred just enough to preserve his authority. I stayed inside Process because Process was the only place his influence weakened. The morning of the review, I arrived early with printed exhibits because public reversals fail when technology fails at the wrong second. Raven sat beside me with a separate drive and checksum copies. Ethan arrived 10 minutes before start time and avoided eye contact until Lena greeted him by name and reminded everyone this was a fact-finding session under council oversight. Miles entered last, carrying no documents, and opened with a statement that patient-facing timelines had been compromised by vendor inflexibility. He meant me when he said vendor, and he meant to define me before evidence appeared. I wrote down his exact phrasing so it could not be softened later. Lena set rules first. She said claims would be tied to records, interruptions would be limited, and minutes would include any correction entered during session. She asked Miles to describe his allegation in one sentence. He said we failed to deliver by 5 p.m. and that inbox delay proved missed deadline. She asked me to respond in one sentence. I said the package was accepted by client gateway at 4:12 p.m. Eastern and contractual custody transferred at that moment under the signed service agreement. That agreement language had been negotiated a year before I inherited the account, and I knew it by paragraph because I had lived inside this risk for months. Miles asked if I was claiming recipients saw the message before 5, trying to pull the room back into perception instead of contract. Lena redirected him and asked Ethan whether gateway acceptance and inbox presentation were distinct technical events. Ethan answered yes and confirmed post-acceptance scanning can delay inbox appearance. She asked if that occurred here. He said yes, and he provided the queue timestamps showing message batches held after acceptance until 5:18 p.m. for enhanced scan policy. He named the policy ticket and approval chain. Miles shifted in his chair and said the policy was routine, which exposed a second contradiction because he had previously framed the delay as vendor error. That was when Lena asked me to read the receipt aloud the moment I described at the beginning. I read it once, then again with time zone callouts, then once more after Miles' questioned format. Raven projected the corresponding immutable journal entry and checksum verification. Ethan confirmed the message ID match between systems. The record became a closed loop, and closed loops end arguments in compliance rooms. I felt my pulse slow for the first time in weeks, not because anyone apologized yet, and not because my reputation was fully repaired, but because the facts were finally occupying the room without distortion. Lena moved from timeline to conduct. She asked why multiple sponsor directives had been issued verbally outside workflow channels, and why confirmation threads contained language inconsistent with those directives. She referenced 3 examples from spring and summer where my recap emails documented requests that later appeared softened in sponsor replies. Miles said verbal urgency is normal in active operations. Lena answered that urgency does not erase record standards when legal deadlines are involved. She asked Priya whether our firm had repeatedly requested workflow adherence and whether those requests were ignored. Priya said yes, and she said our requests were ignored. I watched her choose accuracy over caution in real time. Ethan received the next question, and this was the part he'd been dreading. Lena asked whether IT had been asked to delay disclosure of policy ticket details pending sponsor clearance. He paused, then said yes, and named the office that gave that instruction. He did not look at Miles when he spoke. That admission named the specific methodology that had harmed me, which was public blame, layered over private information control. Once that method was explicit in minutes, reversal was no longer personal. It became governance. Miles started to respond, then stopped when Lena said the record was sufficient for interim findings. The interim findings were plain language with legal precision. Deadline met by vendor, delay internal post-acceptance, sponsor communications outside agreed workflow, and evidentiary inconsistencies requiring sponsor-side corrective action. Lena ordered a formal correction distributed to all recipients of the prior accusation email and attached the corrected timeline. She also required that all future operational directives for regulated communications be issued through documented channels with council visibility. Miles was removed as day-to-day sponsor pending completion of the governance audit, and an interim sponsor from legal operations was assigned immediately. The removal happened in that room, in front of the same witnesses who watched him discredit me. I didn't speak during those final procedural decisions because no speech from me could improve what the record had already done. Public vindication in this world arrives through minutes, corrected distributions, and authority signatures. The room adjourned after 90 minutes. People collected papers quietly. One director who had laughed during that first steering session remark stopped beside my chair and said she had underestimated what I was carrying, then asked if I would brief her team on custody transfer controls next month. I said yes. That was the first request I received in a year that treated my restraint as competence rather than passivity. The correction email landed across both organizations before noon. It stated clearly that our team had met the deadline, that the prior allegation was inaccurate, and that post-acceptance routing delay inside client infrastructure caused delayed inbox appearance. Seeing those sentences in writing mattered more than hearing supportive comments in hallways. Written correction reaches the same audience that absorbed the accusation, and this genre of harm only resolves when the same public record is repaired. Priya called me into her office that afternoon and closed the door with a level of seriousness I had rarely seen from her. She told me the firm's executive committee had reviewed the incident and the broader pattern packet I assembled with Raven. They concluded our existing account governance model exposed delivery leads to sponsor-side narrative risk, and they wanted that model redesigned. Priya said she was promoting me to Director of Client Risk effective immediately, with authority to enforce documentation standards across all regulated accounts and authority to suspend off-workflow directives until council review. She said the title change would be announced at the next all hands and in client communications where relevant. I thanked her and asked one question about scope enforcement when revenue pressure appeared. She said the policy would be board-backed. The public part of that promotion came 3 days later in our firm-wide operations review, and Priya opened by summarizing the incident without naming confidential details, then naming the corrective framework and my role in building it. She said procedural rigor had protected clients and the firm from misattributed liability. She said resilience without evidence is vulnerability, and evidence without discipline is noise. Hearing my work described in those terms in front of the full leadership floor gave me a form of recognition I had been denied for years. I was no longer the quiet person absorbing pressure at the edge of conference tables. I was the person setting the risk standard others would follow. Kettering Biologics completed the governance audit 6 weeks later. The findings mirrored Lena's interim view and added a recommendation that sponsor operations and legal sign-off channels be separated to prevent directive manipulation. Miles remained off daily sponsorship and entered a transition period that ended with his departure from operational oversight. I did not celebrate his exit. I had seen enough systems to know one person rarely creates a culture alone, and replacing a name without fixing incentives changes little. What mattered was that his position in relation to me had collapsed in the only way that counts in regulated work, through documented findings accepted by the institution he had used as a shield. My relationship with Raven changed slowly after the review, almost by accident, because crisis collaboration had already built trust, and we both preferred steadiness over spectacle. We started with late coffee after long days, then weekend walks where neither of us talked about logs for at least an hour. She told me she had noticed how I stayed precise even when people were trying to pull me into emotional self-defense, and she said that precision had a cost she could see from across a room. I told her she had given me something I did not know how to ask for, which was technical certainty at the exact moment my credibility was under organized pressure. People asked later why I did not confront Miles harder in those early meetings. The honest answer is that confrontation without leverage often feeds the story your antagonist is writing about you. He wanted visible friction he could label as insubordination. I gave him documented compliance and calm answers, which looked small in the moment and turned decisive when the record consolidated. Strategic patience is painful when humiliation is public, and I do not romanticize that pain. I remember every meeting where someone looked past me while I answered a question I understood better than anyone in the room. I also remember the exact second those same people started taking notes when I spoke. The framework I built in my new role came directly from that year. Every high-risk communication now required immutable journaling, message ID retention, destination handshake capture, and sponsor directive confirmation in writing within 15 minutes of any verbal instruction. Any request to bypass workflow triggered a formal exception form with council sign-off and explicit risk ownership. If sign-off was absent, send was paused and escalation initiated. None of this was glamorous, and none of it needed to be. Competence in this field rarely looks dramatic while it is working. It looks like constraints that keep blame from outrunning facts. Ethan and I spoke once after the audit closed. He apologised for withholding policy ticket details during the early stage and said he had been trying to keep peace between operations and legal. I told him I understood the pressure and asked him to be direct sooner next time a record dispute crossed his desk. He agreed, and he joined one of my training sessions on cross-system evidence mapping. That conversation mattered because enablers do not become allies through shame. They become allies when the cost of silence becomes explicit and the path to correct action becomes clear. He began flagging sponsor-side routing changes to council automatically after that, which prevented 2 later near misses on different accounts. My internal wound did not disappear when my title changed. Recognition heals part of the injury, and it does not rewrite the years where I learned to be smaller so rooms would feel comfortable while I carried their risk quietly. What changed was my relationship to that wound. I stopped treating composure as a mask and started treating it as a tool I could deploy without erasing myself. I spoke more directly in executive meetings. I named methodology when I saw it, including manufactured ambiguity, audience conditioning, and post hoc narrative substitution. Once people hear those tactics named in plain terms, they lose some of their power. Raven was in the front row during the first firm-wide training I delivered as Director of Client Risk, and I still remember her expression when I put up the incident sequence that had nearly ended my career on paper. I didn't include names. I included mechanics, decision points and controls that would have prevented escalation earlier. I explained why custody transfer definitions matter and why organizations confuse inbox visibility with legal handoff when pressure spikes. I showed how verbal authority can outrun documented authority unless teams insist on traceable directives. The room stayed quiet through the full session, and the questions afterward were serious, specific, and practical. Lena sent me a short note a month later after our firms finalized revised operating terms. She wrote that she appreciated factual discipline under pressure and that she expected our teams to collaborate on a model policy for sponsor communications in regulated environments. I accepted and scheduled the drafting session for the following week. That email closed a loop I had carried from the day she asked me to read the receipt aloud. At the start of this story, she was the counsel who might or might not believe me. By the end, she was a counterpart building controls with me as a peer. I kept one printed artifact from the incident in a folder in my desk, the delivery receipt with the 4:12 p.m. acceptance line and the message ID that tied everything together. I did not keep it as a trophy. I kept it as a reminder that credibility is built before crisis, in quiet choices no one sees, and defended during crisis through records that can stand without your voice. When new delivery leads joined my team and asked why our controls were strict, I showed them that page and explained the cost of leaving interpretive gaps where power can hide. The last time I saw Miles in person was in a lobby outside a legal coordination session he was no longer chairing. He nodded once and said he hoped we could move forward constructively. I said I expected full adherence to documented channels on every active communication, and I asked his interim representative to confirm next week's sign-off windows in writing before noon. She did. That exchange held no drama and no personal victory speech. It held structure, which was all I wanted from the beginning. Public harm had been corrected in public record, and operational authority had shifted to the people willing to defend facts under scrutiny. My story did not end when the meeting ended. It ended when the same witnesses who watched my humiliation watched the correction become binding, when the accusation email was answered by a correction email to the same list, when the sponsor who performed certainty through blame lost the ability to control the channel where truth was recorded, and when my firm made my discipline structural instead of personal. I walked into that year as the person expected to absorb pressure quietly. I walked out as Director of Client Risk, designing the safeguards that keep pressure from rewriting reality. Raven and I left work early the evening my new title became active, and we ate in a small place 2 blocks from the office where no one cared about executive politics or compliance frameworks. She asked whether I finally felt seen. I said I felt legible, which was a better word for me because being seen can still be distorted, and being legible means the record speaks clearly enough that distortion fails. She smiled at that and reached across the table for my hand. I held it, and for the first time in a long while, my body believed the crisis was over. Months later, when new incidents surfaced on other accounts, my team handled them faster because the controls were already in place and the culture had shifted. People escalated sooner. Counsel entered earlier. IT mapped logs without waiting for political permission. Priya backed enforcement even when clients pushed back on pace. That was the final proof that my reversal was complete. It had moved from one woman surviving one accusation to an institutional pattern where the same methodology would fail next time. I had wanted vindication, and I got something larger, a system that no longer required me to bleed privately so facts could survive publicly. When I tell this now, I still feel the sting of that first room where people laughed at business speed. And I still remember the fluorescent light above the table where Lena made me read the timestamp aloud. Both rooms belonged to the same world, and both were full of witnesses. The difference was evidence. In one room, power spoke first and nobody challenged it. In the other, records spoke clearly enough that power had to answer. I learned to endure the first room without surrendering to it, and I learned to build the second room before I needed it.